Good morning. I want today to complete the second half of this sort of two lecture excursus into this huge section of the Summa. It's over half of the total length of the Summa, wedged, as it were, between the two enclosing first part and third part of the Summa. The first part on God, the third part on Christ, and in between there's us and how to live, how to be happy, as I put it in the last lecture. And by the way, in connection with the last lecture, can I correct something which I said? I seem to remember saying, or referring to Aristotle's Greek word for the morally weak person. I wrongly referred to Aristotle's morally weak person as the akolastos. This is quite wrong. The akolastos in Aristotle's Greek refers to the person who is settled in vice, whose vice is deliberate, systematic. I'll speak about such a person further down the line today. Iago, settled in vice. He's not weak. He is strong in vice, determined. Correct Greek word for the person who acts well, who would act well, was too weak to do so. A sort of Othello is the akrates. That's what I should have said, not akolastos, but the akrates, the morally weak person, a person who wants to act well in a rather weak sense of the word wants, but is overwhelmed, as Aristotle puts it, by desire for the contrary, and is, as it were, blown about like a leaf in the winds of contrary desire, and fails to act. In other words, you and me most of the time. Well, that correction in place, what I want to do is to continue this account that Thomas gives of what I called in the last lecture the happy life, the life of the person who's happy. Now, I think just in brief summary of what I said in the last class, I mean, Thomas is very much of the view that everybody seeks happiness, and in seeking happiness, they seek it for its own sake. You don't need a reason to seek happiness. In fact, I think Thomas is of the view that you can't have a reason to seek happiness. Happiness is the reason why we seek anything which we do. I mean, I can ask a person a question, but why did you do that? And she will give a reason. I wanted to annoy my brother or whatever. And I can ask her, but why did you want to annoy your brother? Well, because he's bigger than me and he takes it out on me all the time, and it's about time he learns a lesson, and I'm just going to make life a little bit tough for him. But why do you want to do that? Why is his being a bit of a bully towards you a reason for you retaliating? And you say, well, I think that I'm justified in doing so by this, that, or the other reason, or this or that, the other factor in the situation comes in decisively to suggest, yes, I can do this. But if you push that argument, that questioning further and further back, all along the line, and ultimately you come to you're faced with the objection, but look, I did it because it makes me happy. And I can ask you, why does it make you happy? But what I can't do is to ask you, but why is happiness a reason for doing anything? Because I think Thomas thinks it's become vacuous at that point. you've emptied the stage of all participants in it. There's nothing doing any work anymore, because there isn't a reason why happiness is a reason for doing something. Happiness just is at the background of all reasons. It's there in every reason, whatever, that justifies this, that, or the other, directly or indirectly. Whatever length of chain is involved, the chain stops somewhere, and that is, well, it's happiness that draws me into wanting to act this way. So that would be point number one, and you can see that in making that point is a purely formal point, because the next question is, well, yes, but what does happiness consist in? And Thomas's answer to that is that it consists in one's being drawn in some way or other into a sharing in the divine life itself. That is what is happy, what makes you happy, in the sort of way which leaves no margin left for the question, but why would you want happiness in that form or other? Because there's no space left in the divine life for unhappiness. There's nothing questionable about the happiness that a life lived in and through the divine life itself would bring us. Of course, neither that first nor the second entails the third, or in conjunction entails the third, that everybody seeks God. It doesn't follow from the proposition that everybody seeks happiness, and secondly, that happiness consists in being drawn into divine life, that everybody seeks to be drawn into the divine life, because, of course, people seek happiness in anything but frequently. So there's got to be, as it were, a place for a demonstration of the connection between being drawn into the divine life and one's being happy by virtue of that being drawn into it. People often find happiness, or think they find happiness, in anything else. And maybe they will discover that there is no happiness except in God, but that's a life's work. It's not something which somehow or other is just given. So there isn't a sort of straightforward syllogism, everybody seeks happiness, happiness is to be found in God, therefore everybody seeks God. That, Thomas thinks, as indeed, as if we know Augustine at all, and ask Augustine's Confessions, he knows perfectly well that it takes a huge effort, long, tortuous effort of conversion for the connection to be made between everybody seeks happiness and happiness consists in being drawn into divine life. So the good life is the life which is, for a human being, in time, in history, in how things actually are, leaving aside the fall, but then include the fall. One way or another, there is a task of self-realization, of self-knowledge, of getting, as it were, there to be a consistent and regular coincidence in one's life of the desire for happiness, which is just there in all of us, and the fact that happiness can be found only in God, only in our somehow or other being drawn into the divine life itself, which of course is what we were talking about in the previous lecture before the break, in talking about Thomas on grace, which is precisely that by virtue of which we are drawn into the divine life itself, so that there can be love, the love of friends between us. So what I want to talk to, having spoken to you in those terms about the happy life in the last lecture, I want to talk to you today about the good life, the life that will actually succeed in the end in making us happy. And Thomas says, here we're talking about the first part of the second part, the Prima Secundae, questions 55 following, that we want to talk today about virtue, about happiness, and other things besides. And Thomas begins with a sort of definition of virtue, which he gets from Peter the Lombard, the 12th century author of that work known as the Sentences, the judgments, theological judgments of Peter Lombard. And here's a rough translation of Peter Lombard's Sentences in his definition of what a human virtue is. He says, I quote, a good habit of mind, virtue is a good habit of mind, by which a person lives well, which cannot be employed to an evil end, and is brought about in us by God and not by us. So let's take that definition apart a bit. It's a good habit of mind. The word that Peter Lombard uses and Thomas adopts, the Latin word is habitus. And that's rather misleadingly, that word habitus is rather misleadingly translated into modern English, the modern English habit, because I think the modern English habit carries overtones with it, which are almost the opposite of what Thomas means by a virtue. He means that, Thomas means that a virtue is a disposition, a stable disposition of mind, disposition to judge things in a certain way, so of mind, or of will to act in a certain way, which makes it easy to act in that way, easy to act, and free. Certain sense of spontaneity here. Think of the highly trained expert, whether it's in argument or athletics or in judgment, who acts, as we say, and Thomas means it quite literally, with grace, with ease, with confidence, whose actions speak openly of achievement of a certain kind, which is not laborious, not forced. That's what we mean by grace. It comes out of the blue, not out of effort. It comes, as it were, comes freely. Now, in a certain kind of way, the word habit in modern English, it kind of gets it but doesn't get it. I have the habit of saying, when between one sentence and the next one, I'm thinking of exactly how to put the next sentence. I say, other people at the end of a sentence will constantly say, you know. Do you understand? You get it. But you know, it's very, very common. These are acts which are actually not free. You can't get yourself not to do it. You find yourself doing it, as I just did, in the course of trying to explain what you mean by a habit. And I think in that sense, in which Thomas thinks that a virtue becomes, as it were, a display of skill, ease, strength, grace. So there is that unreflective kind of response which virtue gives, the unreflected, the spontaneous way in which you act, with justice to somebody who is in need of your just action. Then it's a little bit like that bad habit of saying you know, but it's not something which you're entrapped by. On the contrary, it's an exercise of freedom. Whereas the saying you know at the end of a sentence, or before while you're thinking of the next sentence, that is something which you can't control. You just do it in that weak sense of the word habitual, which is there in modern English. So get the distinction right. For Thomas, a habit, in the sense in which a virtue is a habit, it is a freely discharged, graceful action. This connects with what Aristotle, again in the Nicomachean Ethics, says, I think in Book 6 and Book 7, about the difference between a virtue, which makes acting well easy, natural, spontaneous, second nature, as he puts it, contrasts with something which he thinks of as a sort of virtue, a quasi-virtue, on the way to being virtue, but not actually a virtue, what he calls continence. It gets translated as continence, strength of will, mere strength of will, whereby a person is strong enough to withstand temptation to do the contrary. But that strength is a sort of graceless forcing oneself to do something which one doesn't really want to do but thinks one ought. And the word ought, that ugly word of moral obligation, I think such a betraying word of moral obligation. The gritted teeth of the ought, which in a sort of perverted version of Kant becomes the notion of right action understood only in terms of the struggle against temptation to act otherwise. And that sense of it's difficult for me to do this is for Thomas a lack of virtue, and for a certain Kantian, pseudo-Kantian way of understanding things, that's what virtue is exercised as, that is to say, the grit of the teeth. So for Aristotle and for Thomas here, that enjoying the success of others when you have failed, you've come second or third in the race, and your friend wins it and beats you at it, to take pleasure in to find joy in the success of your friend in defeating you, and taking pleasure in that, is, I think, a mark of virtue. And again, to congratulate your friend through gritted teeth is hardly an act of virtue on that account. And I think this is the this idea that it's not a virtue in the fullest sense if it takes an act of will contrary to one's desire to act in accordance with virtue. Then that for Aristotle is a strong-willed person, but needs strong will because that person actually lacks virtue, lacks the facility of acting well. So you can see that this is a description, this notion of acting well, acting in accordance with virtue, as being marked out by the enjoyableness of so acting, is of course an end state. And you can see that the moral life consists not in thus acting, but in, as it were, moving progressively towards the achievement of virtue in that full sense, which of course means that on the way we're going to have more of what Aristotle calls continence than we do of virtue, but that the virtuous life consists in acting in accordance with a view to achieving a final state of finding it easy to act in that kind of way. So that it would be a lack of virtue on this account, a lack of the virtue of temperance, if one couldn't find sex within a marriage, at any rate, to be enjoyable. If one found oneself so indulging in food that it becomes an obsession rather than a free act of enjoyment, or likewise with drink. So the virtue of temperance is a person who actually enjoys good wine and appreciates its goodness as wine, so gets it, but doesn't spoil the goodness of wine by simply getting stupidly drunk on it. And likewise, the distinctions within the sexual life in which you can fail of the virtue of temperance, either by failing to enjoy sex at all, or by becoming entirely self-indulgent in it, which is actually a failure to appreciate the nature of the sexual act itself, which is a sharing, rather than the self-indulgence. And within all this, one finds here Thomas thinking in terms of justice, courage, temperance, as three of the four cardinal virtues, and he thinks of these three, justice, courage, temperance, as virtues of which govern how we desire. They're to do with the formation of good desire. And prudence, the fourth of them, phronesis, which of course doesn't mean prudence at all, which for us has been debased into the idea of caution, of avoiding extremes, which suggests, quite wrongly here, at any rate in Thomas's understanding, as in Aristotle, that avoiding the extremes means basically compromised desire. No, as I said, if you can't enjoy good wine, if you can't enjoy sex, but can only resist temptations to it, then you are a person who hasn't found the point at which your relationship with sex or with drink or with food is truly a virtue, which makes, as it were, which makes for that element or in Peter Lombard's definition, account of virtue as a good habit of mind or will, by which a person lives well and cannot be employed to an evil end. What about that, though? Can't be employed to an evil end. I've lost my place in the notes. 57, 58. No one uses it badly. Here Thomas is again following Aristotle. We'll see how Thomas goes along with Aristotle all the way, and then in the end says, no, this won't do, this doesn't tell us where we're going to go. But up to this point, Thomas is following Aristotle pretty closely. No one uses badly, and Thomas appeals to an Aristotelian distinction between an art and a virtue. An art, a skill, whether, say, of rhetoric, of argument, of design, of art in the visual sense, or art good musical judgment. Well, he says you can possess such things, but entirely without virtue. And here we get into a very complex, very interesting, interesting conundrum. What are we to say about a wholly evil but brilliant rhetorician, Iago, in Othello, Shakespeare's Othello? Hitler. Imagine a Hitler. Let's just for the purposes think of the Holocaust as having been designed and entirely executed by Hitler. Of course, Hitler couldn't have pulled off the Holocaust without the genius of organization, which was Himmler, Heinrich Himmler. But think of Hitler or Himmler, whatever you like. Yeah. What would you say about a less dedicated pursuer of the Holocaust than Hitler actually was? Well, Hitler's Holocaust enacted by a lazy Hitler who gets up in the morning and says, oh God, no, not more work on that. I can't be bothered with it today. Well, the consequences would have been far less drastic, but would Hitler have been a better person? Because he's lazy, a lazy murderer. What do we say about Iago? The cunning, brilliant exploiter of people's vulnerabilities. What is he exercising in the course of that goading provocation of suspicion in Iago, in Othello, whose vulnerabilities are exploited by this man who so expertly understands the vulnerabilities of human nature, who's a brilliant psychologist and uses his brilliant understanding of how to bring about the downfall of Othello to even get him to murder his wife, Desdemona. So what are we to say about that? Do we want to say that, well, if only Iago had been turned around so that actually he could deploy all these skills in the exercise of virtue, then he would have been a saint. As if there's some sort of underpinning of commonality between the genius of the saint and the genius of Iago, that there's a common substratum of skill which can be deployed to a good end or to a bad end. But it's a common skill. Well, that's precisely what Thomas, following Peter Lombard, is ruling out. That kind of analysis says the possession of a virtue is the possession of a skill which nobody can use badly, which can't be used badly. It isn't, as it were, a common substratum of insight into human nature, which is deployed equally by Iago on the one hand and by the great saint on the other. So it's not that's to go back to Hitler, that Hitler was some sort of organizational genius. Or a person of great determination of character, which, if only they'd been possessed by somebody of virtue, would have made him a saint. No, I mean that's not Thomas's analysis, and I think he's quite right. By the way, I mean I think this is a complete misconstrual of Hitler's, the force of Hitler. I think a similar sort of notion is there in Nietzsche, the great willed person, as if there was some sort of neutral capacity called will, which is common to the person of great virtue and great vice, and makes them equally great if in the opposite directions by virtue of the opposite deployment of one and the same skills. Thomas says, no, there is no possibility that there is that degree of common ground between the great sinner and the great saint. So, no, there isn't a common substratum of greatness which is deployed indifferently to the pursuit of virtue or the pursuit of vice. They are psychologically wholly different capacities in those two. And that is at root where Thomas marks the distinction between art and virtue. Because great artistic skill can be deployed in a foul and evil end, whereas the strengths that are there in virtue cannot be deployed in the pursuit of vice. There is no common substratum of strength between the strength of a person's vicious character and the strength of a person's virtuous character. The word strength is used equivocally in those two cases. So, cunning in Iago isn't the prudentia of the great saint, prudence, the phronesis of the great saint, just deployed to different purposes. You cannot use prudence badly. You cannot use your sense of justice in the service of something foul, evil. It can't be the same common substratum. And I think this is hugely important in one's understanding of evil. And by the way, I think it serves, that distinction serves one well, as some of the better writing about the Holocaust acknowledges, in the notion that evil is not great, shown to be great in the case of the Holocaust. Great, even in a perverse way, great, it is banal. It's empty, it's vacuous, it's not good strengths used to bad ends. It is banality. And I think Thomas is close to Hannah Arendt in his understanding, or Hannah Arendt is close to Thomas, at least in that connection. Now, I've mentioned these four natural virtues, as Thomas thinks of them. He derives them from Plato, of prudence, justice, courage, and temperance. And they're sort of human virtues. I mean, they belong, Thomas thinks, following actually it's following Plato, not Aristotle, following the sort of Platonic tradition, that these form, as it were, substratum of the good life for a human being. And that's all well and good, but only up to a point, because at a certain point, Thomas actually turns the tables on this whole, as he thinks of it, pagan notion of virtue, and says firmly that, yes, of course, prudence, courage, justice, courage and temperance are virtues, but they can't really be possessed fully as virtues in a natural human being. In separation, to put it bluntly, in separation from the theological virtue of charity, they're not really virtues at all. They wouldn't be virtues at all. They'd be sort of sham. Yeah? They would lack, he says, the former of virtue, the form, the shape of virtue. They lack the strength of it. They lack the point of it, because the strength of all the virtues and the point of all the virtues, their character of being virtues, all derive from as it were, they're being formed formata by charity, and this is the point that Peter Lombard is making, and Thomas picks up that these virtues, the definition of virtue, it includes this phrase with which Peter Lombard's definition ends. There are these habits, good habits of action, which nobody can use badly, that God works in us and without us. So they give the virtuous life its shape as virtue, as a virtuous person, only insofar as they are formed, given that shape, by ultimately the love of God and the love of neighbour in God. And Thomas's discussion of this in the second part of the Summa, when he discusses the theological virtues, taking up Paul's notion that somehow or other is charity, which when all drops away, otherwise when in the beatific vision there's no longer any need for justice, because the just community is entirely formed by the reality of the vision of God formed within it. When there's no need any longer for a particular judgment which sorts out exactly the right way to behave, which is what prudence shows us, directs us towards. When we no longer need that courage, which is understood as the ability to resist all natural forms of human fear, because all causes of fear are removed from us, and when we are fully capable of enjoying precisely what is fulfilling of us, human beings, so the virtue of temperance is fulfilled, what remains is charity, because that's the point and substance of all the other virtues, is that somehow or other they form within us that this virtue of charity. Well, that's Thomas's sort of comment on Peter Lombard's understanding of virtue. And the virtuous life is a life lived in accordance with virtue, and it is thus that we become fully human. And that brings me to a last point in this connection, which I just want to, as it were, do a sort of thought experiment and to compare Thomas on and his account of virtue with a complex dialectical account of the good life, as one might call it, that one finds in a completely different thinker, the 19th century Danish philosopher, theologian, Søren Kierkegaard. In his work Fear and Trembling, for me probably his central work, I'm not an expert in Kierkegaard, but certainly I can resonate with Kierkegaard's problem in that book of his, Fear and Trembling. He sort of raises the question, this is not exactly his terms, but I mean, he sort of raises the question, how can you acquire virtue if you don't already have it? And if you do have it, then how can you have any need to acquire it? Well, in the course of his sort of thinking through the issues here, he compares, as it were, three kind of life worlds. The life world of Don Juan, that's us Don Giovanni if you prefer. Secondly, Socrates, and thirdly, Abraham. These three lives are entirely discontinuous from one another. Don Juan is a person who lives without any kind of centre of gravity, moral centre of gravity. He lacks any kind of fixed boundaries. He does exactly what he likes. In fact, he's really got a problem here because he can't not do exactly what he likes. He can only do exactly what he likes. There is in him no capacity to do otherwise than exactly what takes him for an immediate reason for acting. He'll do what he likes. He's, as it were, the amoralist. In him is the paradox which Bernard Williams raised in his wonderful little book on morality. The person who lacks any reason to do anything other than that which serves his own interests. And of course, if you're like that, if you've got, as it were, an ideal type of the Don Juan, who is so self-enclosed in his own desires for this, that, or the other, the satisfaction of his own desires, then there can't be a reason why Don Juan would act otherwise. There can't be a reason why a Don Juan should become a Socrates. A Socrates is a person who acts in accordance with settled moral principles. He acts in the name, as Kierkegaard puts it, of the universal. One must never act in this way. One must always act in that way. He has universals, and his individuality as Socrates is to be found within precisely the shape of his life. It's a life which has a shape. It's shaped by universal principles, whereas Don Juan, of course, has a life which has no shape at all. He is a kind of glob, a moral glob. Ever considered being a moral glob? Sounds quite a fancy way of being, but I mean, Don Juan has no moral shape at all because he's not shaped by any principles, by no consistency. There's no meaning to his life because there's no grammar, as it were, moral grammar to his life. Whereas Socrates is all moral grammar, if you like. He speaks perfectly correctly, with accuracy, with precision. So he's obedient to the universal. His individuality, of which Don Juan has none. He has no, as it were, persona. Socrates is individuated precisely by his adherence, his obedience to the universal. And Abraham makes the leap of faith. He is faced with the demands made by God upon him to sacrifice his son. I say this is a terrible interpretation of the Genesis story. I think it's quite untrue to what's going on within it. But anyway, fanciful as it is, it gives a certain sense that there's a theological grounding to this description of this, as it were, pure individual who, in order to be true ultimately to the command of God, must transgress the universal that Socrates imposes. So, and just as there can be no reason in Don Juan to act as Socrates, so there can be no reason in Socrates' life to abandon precisely that which gives it shape, namely the universal moral principle. So there's an utter discontinuity between Don Juan, Socrates, and Abraham. You can't become Socrates from within the standpoint of Don Juan. There can be nothing in the position of the individuation achieved by Socrates which is a ground for transgressing the universal and as it making this leap of faith beyond it. There's nothing in the one which can possibly be a reason for the other, and nothing in the other which can possibly be a reason for taking the step into the third. And so there's sort of utter discontinuities between. Now, you can see what Kierkegaard is up to here, that if you have, as many within the philosophical world of since at least Hobbes, and spectacularly in Hobbes, an entirely egotistical understanding of human nature, then it is very, very difficult to see how a person who is purely egotistical in motivation can be got to see why there is a reason for acting selflessly in such a manner as is capable of producing any form of human society. Because the very motivation that Don Juan has of an egotistical self-reference defeats and undermines the very character of the Socratic as universal. So there's got to be what Kierkegaard calls a leap of faith between Don Juan on the one hand and Socrates on the other, between Socrates also and then Abraham. Now, this raises a question as to whether there can be any such thing as moral progress at all. How can you get progressively from a basic condition of, as it were, Don Juan to be brought into through a moral transformation into the universe, the moral universe of Socrates? Well, I think Thomas is just a whole lot less existential and a whole lot more relaxed about all this. That there is a dynamic here. There's no ultimate paradox. It is true that in the end, for Thomas, it is grace that ultimately and alone can make us human. But there is never in us that sort of exclusive character of the Don Juan, with no element of Socrates within it. That there is continuity and not discontinuity between our fallen selves and our redeemable selves, between our redeemable selves and what is possible for us by way of faith. That there is some continuity here, and there's a dynamic and no ultimate paradox. It is true that in the end it is grace for Thomas that ultimately and alone can make us fully human. It is true for Thomas that it takes the more than human to be at least human. So we can't really be human at all except by virtue of a grace which is not earned by us morally. So that that point that Peter Lombard makes, that this virtue is brought about in us by God and not by us. So ultimately there is a dependence upon the work of God. If we're to be human at all, then by virtue of grace we have to be more than human, something that is not owed to us, something which is simply given to us. And for that reason it is in the end for Thomas that when Aristotle says that if you want to know how to be a good, how to act well, then go and have a look at the good man and see how he or she acts. The only thing for Aristotle is that he hasn't got a good man. There isn't a good man, a man who is totally capable to be imitated, to be followed. In which, as it were, the fulfillment of morality can be seen to flourish, in which that being so deeply human is at the same time to be more than human, which is that possibility which has to be there somehow or other. But Thomas, it is there, of course, somehow or other, precisely in incarnation, in Christ. That there we can see how it takes the need to be more than human to be at least human, and I think that is at the centre. It's the centre of gravity of Thomas's moral thinking, of his account of how to be happy, of his account of how to live the life of virtue. It is to be, of course, to find the solution to the problem which Aristotle can't give in the image of the incarnate God in Christ. And of course there not that we have to mention it right now, but we're going to have to see that in the end, if you want to follow the good man who is Christ, then you have to remember that in the end, that good man gets knackered. That because he loves in a certain kind of way, he has to be killed. But that's another story which we'll begin on Thursday. So enough for now.